He had 6 hours to restart the pump house before the whole valley flooded. Dean Ashworth had $6, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job on a flood control maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any pump station he passed for signs of proper operation. A habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten infrastructure that kept him fed for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 22 years old, laid off 8 months earlier, when the regional water management authority that employed him privatized its flood control maintenance division, eliminating his entire crew in a single round of contract changes. He had been moving through low-lying farm valleys ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The privatization decision had come with barely 2 weeks' notice, the authority's own explanation citing cost efficiencies that Dean had come to recognize across 8 months of towns exactly like this one, as a specific bureaucratic dialect for deciding that a technician's actual familiarity with a valley's specific flood risks mattered less than whatever a private contractor's centralized approach could theoretically manage across several regions instead. He had grown up around exactly this kind of infrastructure, his own grandfather having maintained flood control systems for nearly 4 decades before him, and he had learned, riding along on inspection runs as a boy, the particular gravity of a pump station's true purpose, that behind every hum of a working motor sat an entire community trusting that hum to keep their homes and fields dry through whatever storm eventually tested it. He found the old pump house on a stormy evening in early autumn, a squat concrete building at the base of a levee protecting a broad agricultural valley below, its main pump silent, despite rain already hammering the surrounding fields, hard enough to raise standing water in the low ditches. Dean approached carefully through the downpour and found an elderly man inside, working frantically at an electrical panel with hands that shook from more than simply the cold. "You picked a strange night to come wandering through here," the man said, not looking up from his work. "Unless you know something about pump motors, in which case you picked exactly the right one." "I used to maintain flood control equipment," Dean said. "What's happened?" "Main pump motor burned out an hour ago," the man said. "Name's Harlan Quinn. I've run this station for 31 years, and I've never once seen a storm dump this much rain this fast. Without that pump running, the water coming off these fields has nowhere to go but up, and this whole valley sits low enough that 6 hours from now, every farm and half the town below us is going to be standing in floodwater that never should have reached them." "How much time do we actually have?" Dean asked. "The backup pump can hold the water level steady for maybe 6 hours before the ditches overflow entirely," Harlan said. "After that, it's simply a matter of how fast the water rises and how many people don't get warned in time to move what they can before it does." "Has anyone in the valley been warned yet, in case this doesn't work?" Dean asked. "County's aware and standing by to issue an evacuation notice if we can't get this fixed," Harlan said. "I'd rather that never becomes necessary. Half these families have nowhere else to go on short notice, and the ones who do would lose crops and livestock they can't afford to lose." "Show me the motor," Dean said. "I'd rather understand exactly what we're dealing with before either of us decides what's actually possible in 6 hours. Harlan led him to the pump house's main chamber, where a large electric motor sat silent, its housing scorched at one connection point, the acrid smell of burned insulation still hanging thick in the humid air. Dean examined the damage carefully, understanding within minutes that the burnout, while serious, hadn't destroyed the motor entirely, the kind of failure that a skilled technician with the right parts might actually repair rather than simply replace outright. He traced the scorch marks with a careful finger, checking the extent of the damage against what he remembered of similar failures from his own years on a maintenance crew. "This is fixable," Dean said, "assuming we can find replacement windings or a compatible substitute motor somewhere within reach in the next few hours. I don't have the parts on me, and I doubt you do either. There's a scrap yard 2 towns over that used to supply parts for exactly this kind of equipment, Harlan said. I don't know if they're even open this late, or whether they'd have anything compatible on such short notice. Call them, Dean said. I'll start working on what I can address here in the meantime. Every minute we're not actively working against this deadline is a minute we can't get back later. Harlan spent the following 20 minutes on the phone, his voice growing increasingly desperate as he worked through a list of contacts, while Dean began disassembling the damaged motor's housing, understanding exactly which components might be salvageable and which would need outright replacement, regardless of what the scrapyard search eventually produced. He set the salvageable pieces aside carefully, understanding that even small savings of time later could matter enormously given how little margin the night actually allowed. Harlan returned with news that struck a careful balance between hope and continued urgency. Scrapyard's closed for the night, but the owner lives above the shop and agreed to open up once I explained what's at stake. Problem is, it's a 40-minute drive each way in this weather, and I don't trust these roads well enough anymore to make that drive myself safely. I'll go, Dean said. You keep the backup pump running and monitor the water level. If I'm not back within 2 hours, you'll need to start warning the valley regardless of whether we found what we need. Dean made the drive through driving rain and standing water, already beginning to pool across low sections of the county road, arriving at the scrap yard to find its elderly owner, a man named Otto Voss, waiting with a flashlight and a genuine willingness to help, despite the hour. Otto's own porch light was the only illumination visible for what felt like miles along the dark county road. A welcome beacon after 40 tense minutes of navigating flooding roads mostly by instinct. Harlan's called me for parts more times than I can count over the years, Otto said, leading Dean through the yard's dark rows of salvaged equipment, rain still hammering both of them despite the ponchos Otto had thoughtfully brought along. Never once at midnight during a flood emergency, though. Let's see what we can find you. They located a compatible motor within 20 minutes, salvaged from a decommissioned industrial pump considerably larger than what the station actually needed, but with windings Dean determined could be adapted with careful rewiring rather than requiring an exact match. Otto pulled the motor's specification plate out from under a coat of grime with his own flashlight, cross-referencing the numbers against what Dean described needing, both men working with the particular efficient focus of people who understood exactly how little time remained to spare on anything beyond the essential task at hand. This ought to work, with the right adjustments, Otto said. Not a perfect match, but a determined man with proper tools could make it function well enough for what you're describing. Otto refused payment entirely, understanding the stakes involved, and helped Dean load the heavy motor into his own truck bed before sending him back out into the storm. Tell Harlan I expect a proper thank you dinner once this is all settled, Otto called after him. And not before I hear the whole story of how close this actually came. Yet the return drive took considerably longer than the trip out, flooding already claiming sections of the road that had been merely wet an hour earlier, and Dean found himself navigating carefully around standing water deep enough to stall a lesser vehicle, understanding that losing the truck now would cost the valley below considerably more than simply his own inconvenience. He kept the motor's fragile windings covered from the worst of the rain with a top Otto had insisted on providing, checking the load security at each turn, despite his own mounting exhaustion. Twice, he encountered sections of road where the standing water had risen high enough that he genuinely wasn't certain the truck would make it through, and both times he pressed forward regardless, understanding that turning back now, this close to running out of time, would cost the valley considerably more than the risk of a stalled engine. The truck's headlights caught nothing but sheets of rain and the dark shapes of flooded fields on either side of the road, the whole drive feeling, to Dean, like navigating through a landscape that had already half surrendered to the very disaster he was racing to prevent. He reached the pump house with just over 3 hours remaining before Harlan's projected overflow point, and the two of them worked together through the following hours with a focus born of genuine desperation, Dean handling the technical rewiring, while Harlan assisted with the physical labor of positioning and securing the replacement motor despite his own advancing age and exhaustion. "My father built this pump house back in the 30s, Harlan told Dean, working alongside him as the storm continued hammering the building's roof. "Whole Valley used to flood regularly before this station went in. Lost crops and sometimes lives to water that had nowhere proper to drain. I've spent 31 years making sure that history didn't repeat itself. I don't intend to let one bad motor be the reason it finally does." "It won't be," Dean said, though his own confidence felt considerably thinner than his voice suggested, given how much remained uncertain about whether the adapted motor would actually integrate properly with the station's existing electrical system. "How long have you known this work before that layoff took it from you?" Harlan asked, passing Dean a tool without being asked, the two of them having settled into an easy rhythm despite the pressure bearing down on both of them. "My whole life, more or less," Dean said. "My grandfather did exactly this kind of work. I used to think it would always matter to somebody, the way it mattered to him. I've spent 8 months learning that's not always true, whatever the actual value of the work itself." "It matters tonight," Harlan said simply. "I don't think that's nothing, whatever a company spreadsheet decided about it 8 months ago." The rewiring proved more complicated than Dean had initially estimated. The salvaged motor's specifications close enough to work, but different enough to require careful recalculation of the connection points, work he performed with the particular focused precision of someone who understood that a mistake here could cost them the remaining time entirely, rather than simply delaying success. He checked each connection twice against his own hastily sketched diagram, understanding that a single miscalculation at this stage could mean starting over with no time left to do so. With just over an hour remaining, Dean completed the final connections and, with Harlan standing ready at the electrical panel, gave the signal to bring the system online. Both men stood in tense silence for the several seconds it took the panel to cycle through its startup sequence, the storm still hammering the roof above them, the only other sound the anxious rhythm of their own breathing. The motor caught on the second attempt, a deep mechanical groan rising into a steady, powerful hum as the pump began drawing water through the station's intake once more. The sound considerably more beautiful to both men in that moment than any music either could remember hearing. Harlan let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, gripping the edge of the control panel for support as the weight of the previous hours finally caught up with him. "That's it," Harlan said, his voice breaking with a relief that had clearly been holding back considerable fear through the entire ordeal. "That's the sound of this valley staying dry tonight." They monitored the pump's performance carefully through the remaining hours before dawn, Dean checking the adapted motor's temperature repeatedly to ensure the improvised repair was holding steady under full load, while Harlan tracked the water level in the surrounding ditches, watching it stabilize and then, gradually, begin to recede as the pump's steady operation finally caught up with the storm's continued rainfall. By morning, with the worst of the storm past and the pump running steadily on its improvised repair, the valley below remained entirely dry. The flooding that had seemed nearly inevitable 6 hours earlier everted through a night of frantic, uncertain work that neither Dean nor Harlan had been entirely confident would actually succeed until the moment the motor finally caught. Word of the near disaster and its narrow resolution spread through the valley community within days, and the Water Management Authority, once informed of exactly how close the region had come to serious flooding over a single failed motor with no proper backup system in place, agreed to fund a permanent redundant pump installation, ensuring no future failure could threaten the valley on such short notice again. The authority's own regional director visited the station personally the following week, reviewing Dean and Harlan's account of the night alongside the improvised repair itself, and left visibly shaken by how narrow the margin had actually been. 6 hours and no backup system beyond a temporary pump that could only hold the line, not actually solve the problem, the director said, examining the salvaged motor's rewired connections with evident respect. I don't think this authority fully understood the risk we were carrying until we very nearly learned it the hard way. She spent nearly an hour walking the station with them, asking detailed questions about exactly how the improvised repair had functioned, understanding, evidently, that the authorities' own future planning depended on learning properly from a night that could easily have ended in genuine disaster rather than narrow success. Dean stayed on at the pump station through that winter, and the ones that followed, formally hired by the authority to serve alongside Harlan as the station's junior operator, a position that gave him steady work and, considerably more than that, the particular satisfaction of having proven in one desperate night exactly the kind of value his own laid-off crew had once provided before a private contractor's cost-cutting decided otherwise. He spent that first year helping install and calibrate the new redundant pump system, understanding the particular satisfaction of building genuine protection rather than simply reacting to its absence during a crisis. My father would have been glad to know this station finally has proper backup protection, Harlan told Dean, some months later, watching the newly installed redundant pump cycle through its own routine test. He always said a system protecting people's homes and livelihoods should never depend on a single point of failure, whatever a budget review might decide about the cost of redundancy. I think he'd have been glad about more than just the redundancy, Dean said. I think he'd have been glad you didn't have to face that 6 hours entirely alone, whatever the eventual outcome turned out to be. Otto Voss got his promised thank-you dinner that spring, hosted at Harlan's own kitchen table, the three of them sharing the full story of that stormy night with a fourth guest, the Valley's own regional director, who had insisted on hearing it firsthand from everyone involved before finalizing the authorities' funding for the new system. Dean thought, some evenings that winter, about the 8 months of towns and privatization notices that had led him to a flooding pump house on an ordinary stormy evening, and understood, watching the Valley's farms remain safely dry through storm after storm that followed, that he had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose he'd feared he might never find again. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of arriving with exactly 6 hours to spare, and making every single one of them count for an entire valley that would never fully know how close it had come to losing everything. He wrote to his own mother that winter as well, describing the pump house and the 6-hour deadline and the whole strange sequence of events that had followed, understanding, as he wrote it out plainly for the first time, exactly how narrow the margin had actually been between the valley staying dry and losing considerably more than anyone below the levee had ever properly understood was at risk. Her reply came within the week, brief but proud in the particular way Dean remembered her always being. Your grandfather used to say the best flood control work is the kind nobody ever notices, because it means the disaster never happened. Sounds like you gave this valley exactly that kind of quiet protection, even if it took a genuinely loud night to get there. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many communities depend entirely on a single piece of aging infrastructure, one failure away from disaster, without anyone quite realizing how thin that protection actually is until the night it's tested? And what does it take? 6 hours, a scrapyard owner willing to open at midnight, a stranger who understood exactly which repairs actually mattered, for an entire valley to stay dry instead of underwater. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Salvage Line for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.